Hi, Chrysta. Thank you so much for joining Progress Texas today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Happy hour.
Yeah, thank you so much. You are up in Dallas, and I know right now you are running for Texas Railroad Commissioner. How has the campaign been going during COVID-19?
Well, we've had to adjust very rapidly, which we've done. We held our first virtual town hall on oil and the Texas economy on Tuesday. We had a sold out audience on Zoom. So it was wonderful. I mean, there's so much going on right now that the Texas Railroad Commission is and needs to be involved with, that interest has really picked up. So it's actually been great.
That's amazing. What has been bringing you joy right now? I want to start on a happy note, but what has been bringing you joy right now through all of this?
Well, as a result of the fact that we are not driving and airplanes are not flying, the sky is the most incredible blue up here. It's just been spectacular days, and I haven't had to go into the office, and so I've gotten out to enjoy them.
That's amazing. Oh, I love that. Yeah, we've talked a little bit internally at Progress Texas about how the need to still take care of our environment has not gone away, but we're enjoying seeing kind of the greenery of Texas and like the animals of Texas flourish during this time.
Exactly, and including all of the human animals who are now going outside and walking around.
Yes, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the Railroad Commission because it has nothing to do with railroads, but I'm curious where your passion to want to run for this race comes from, and what does the Railroad Commission do?
Oh, those are great questions. So the Railroad Commission, as you said, has not one thing to do with railroads. It has everything to do with oil and gas. And so it is our oil and gas regulator here in the state of Texas. And it has an incredible responsibility for our natural resources and for our environment, as well as for that very important segment of our economy, which is the oil economy here in Texas, which is cratering right now. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But to your question about why I decided to run for this, first of all, it's our best opportunity to win statewide as Democrats in over 25 years. The incumbent lost his election, so it is a wide open seat, and we are going to do great things statewide this election cycle. So that was one factor. Another factor, frankly, is, I've got the background and the experience for this position. I think as Progress Texas said in its endorsement, every notch on my belt has been preparing me for this. And that is so true. You know, I graduated with an engineering degree in 1985, was going to go to work as an engineer in the industry, but there was a huge downturn. So I instead went into consulting and wrote software systems for oil and gas companies. Then I went to law school, and ever since have been involved in litigation and legal issues in and around the oil industry, both on behalf of landowners and royalty owners, on behalf of companies big and small. And I love using my technical expertise and my legal expertise, and the Railroad Commission position requires both of those. We need somebody who's willing and ready and able to jump in and help solve some of the critical problems our state is now facing.
Absolutely. And we have a question from Satvik on our team. So with all of that, why is it called the Railroad Commission still?
Yeah, so it's over 100 years old. In fact, it was most active during the Great Depression 100 years ago, and I'll talk probably about that in a minute. But over 100 years ago, it was set up to regulate railroad transportation. There were farmers who could not get reliable pricing and access to railroads to ship their commodities in Texas. And so it was originally to set up to monitor railroads. And then other things got added to it over the years, and railroads went away in 2005. So it's now oil and gas.
Wow. Is there any movement right now to change the name of it? I mean,
Well, we progressives, we Democrats are always trying to have transparency in government. And so there's always been a press the last several cycles, at least, to try to get the legislature to rename the Texas Railroad Commission. And it should be renamed because, again, we do like transparency in government. We actually want people to know who's in charge of oil and gas, who's in charge of these issues, and it would be good to rename it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So right now, I mean, the Texas Railroad Commission has been meeting over the last few weeks. What have they been doing right now during COVID, especially with what is going on with Texas oil, which I don't know a whole lot about. So I would love for you to clue us in on that as well.
Sure. Okay. Well, let me start with what's going on with Texas oil, and it's actually what's going on with oil all over the world. So you and I are talking virtually. We're not in a room together where we've driven to, and everybody else who's listening has driven to that room to all be together. We're not using our cars. We're not flying on airplanes, and the demand for oil has cratered. So we are using 30 or 40% less oil than we did 6 weeks ago. At the same time, Russia and Saudi Arabia have glutted the market with oil, trying to unload as much as they can because their governments depend on selling oil and the revenues that come from oil. Texas does too. You probably know that 20% of our state revenues are generated by oil and gas extraction, and royalties that come from operations on state-owned lands like the university lands. They fund our education system, they fund our highway and transportation system, and they contribute revenues to the general fund. So oil is a very big and important part of the Texas economy that we don't have another source to get those funds right now. So all of this has come together. Demand is going down. The prices have dropped out, and literally in a few weeks, there will be no place to put the oil. Everything will cease. I mean, it's like if you just shut down an assembly line. That's what's going to happen. The Railroad Commission actually has a very, very important regulatory role. For over 100 years, it was the original OPEC. It was supposed to smooth out supply and demand and make sure that we were protecting our natural resources in the form of the oil and gas and not allowing it to go to waste. And so that's what's going on at the Railroad Commission right now, is they're having hearings on whether to do what they have historically done, but what the Republicans have refused to even allow to happen in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, they kind of shut down the machinery, the regulatory know-how that would allow them to do this, mothballed it, and now nobody knows how to do it. And it's a real emergency, just like, making sure we have a functioning public health system when we need it. It's exactly the same kind of thing.
So they've been meeting and having these hearings. Is there any movement? Like, are they going to help folks in Texas here?
Sure. If you ask me now versus 4 hours from now, the answer may change. But right now, so some of the oil and gas companies who have historically opposed this vociferously, they have asked for the Railroad Commission to enact production controls again. And right now, it looks like the oil company, the industry sentiment is about 50-50 on whether it should be done or not. But what this does is it presents an incredible opportunity for the environmentalists who definitely want to cut back on oil production, and some of the companies who definitely want to make sure that the market is not oversupplied and stabilize the market, to work together to see if we can't actually enact some change here and do something that's a lot more sensible. And let me also mention this. Hundreds of thousands of jobs are being lost as a result of these huge market swings. We cannot afford that. I mean, it's gonna crash our economy here in Texas for a long time unless we try to smooth some of this out. So right now, the nose counting is there are 3 commissioners. One has said he's definitely for, one is saying he's definitely against, and I think it's Chrysta who has not come out one way or the other.
Wow. So a lot is kind of falling to these Texas families who either work in the oil industry or have a family member who works in the oil industry right now. How do we, despite all of this, and despite what these 3 people on the commission are talking about and doing right now, how do we take care of those families who work in that industry?
Such an excellent question. Obviously, we've got to make sure that the unemployment payment machinery is functioning, because there's going to be a lot of unemployed workers. Longer term, what we really needed to do is adopt the kind of mindset of the AFL-CIO, which is to gradually transition from oil-related jobs to cleaner, greener jobs. And on that, I wanted to just highlight one thing that I was trying to work on in this campaign, and that is by reducing the flaring, which is the intentional lighting on fire of natural gas. It's a huge waste, and there's so much of it going on. If we actually converted that flared natural gas into electricity there in the Permian and supplied the grid up there, what we could do is there'd be so much generation going on that we could actually move server farms and new computer operations out to the great West Texas area that's going to need jobs and is going to need stability. And I'd still like to see that happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I do want to transition to talking about this green energy and making this transition for Texans. I myself am from the Rio Grande Valley, and wind farms in just the last 10 years have gone in, scattered across the counties down there. We know that if progressives like yourself were in office, like Texas would be investing more in green energy. Mm-hmm. What can the Railroad Commission do, and what is your vision for how we bring those Texans who currently work in the oil industry with us in that transition?
Well, like I said, it would be great if we could transition, as we transition to cleaner, greener energy, transition the jobs that are actually located out where the oil producing counties are over to something like computer server farms, or a newer vision of the economy for that sector. What's really important here, though, we also have to think about a smooth transition of, again, our public finance system. We do not charge for severance taxes, and there are those big, huge turbines that are in West Texas or in the Rio Grande Valley that generate wind energy. They're actually leased kind of the same way that you lease oil and gas extraction. But we don't charge any severance taxes for that energy. And I'm not suggesting that we should, but what I am saying is that we have not found in the transition from oil to a cleaner, greener energy portfolio how to replace the revenues that we need to operate the state. So that's up to the legislature. And the other thing that's up to the legislature is there is no one agency that has any kind of jurisdiction over the whole of the energy portfolio that supplies Texas. And we need to make sure that we have energy security as well as revenue sources, and as well as an environmental outlook on all of this. So we really need the legislature to act and look to our future and what is the agency that's going to best serve all of those needs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight. I want to thank folks who are just tuning in. If you have any questions, please comment with them either on Facebook or Twitter, and we will get to them, I promise. I want to talk a little bit about our climate crisis. And we know that Texans, especially Texans who are Black and brown or lower income, or who are in areas that are hardest hit by some of this climate change, they are impacted more than others. What do you think is the state's role in our climate crisis right now, and what can Texas do to combat this?
Well, and my standard pitch on this issue is this is the most important environmental race in the country in 2020. Why? Because nothing has a bigger impact on the climate than oil and gas extraction, and nowhere is oil and gas bigger than right here in Texas. So this is a really critical race for those issues. And yes, communities that are underserved and economically disadvantaged and communities of color are the ones that are typically impacted by any environmental lapse. Climate change, good old clean air, clean water, don't mess with Texas. When we fail to respect those issues, it falls hardest on the underserved communities. And so that's why it's so critical that we get it right at the Texas Railroad Commission and in the legislature.
Yeah, yeah. That makes absolute sense. I mean, you've worked in this industry for quite some time. How can we hold these big companies accountable?
Well, so for example, on the flaring issue, so flaring and methane, which is what happens when they don't light the fire on the natural gas, but they just let it escape. Methane emissions happen, and all of that stuff causes cancer. It permeates our water, it permeates our air, it permeates the soil. So we really needed to be cutting back on flared and vented natural gas. And my concern is that with the industry downturn, especially venting, and I think it was the Environment Texas that just put out a study, it's gone up like 7 times. It's insane. So we really need the Railroad Commission to help transition the operators to, compliance with the law. We need better enforcement at the Railroad Commission. We need an overhaul of how those practices are allowed to proceed. That's how we make sure that the energy companies, the oil companies, serve our environmental protections.
And I love that you said that this is the most important race when it comes to the environment, like in the US right now. We do have a question from someone who just tuned in on what does the Railroad Commission do? And so do you mind kind of going into why?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'll be happy to do that. So the Railroad Commission oversees oil and gas extraction, particularly what we call the upstream sector, which is the drilling and the production at the wellheads and what people call fracking, which is actually a bunch of related issues. It oversees the safety of all of that. It oversees the protection of the natural resources that are the oil and gas, to make sure that we are not wasting those things. It has environmental concerns that are reflected in the regulations, such as the absolute law against flaring, unless you're within the first 10 days of producing a well. After that, it's illegal unless you go to the Railroad Commission for a permit. It also has some oversight of pipeline safety, if those pipelines are intrastate pipelines, not the big interstate pipelines. It does not have anything to do with where the pipelines go, or how much landowners are paid for pipelines to cross their properties. It doesn't have anything to do with the royalties that people get from oil companies. It also doesn't have anything to do with clean energy, and it doesn't have anything to do with truck traffic, which is a question I get a lot. So it's a really great question to ask what the Railroad Commission does and doesn't do, and it's not a simple question at all. There are a lot of things that people think it should be doing that it doesn't do, and some things that people don't know that it should be doing that it's supposed to do.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like, I mean, just the fact that it's still called the Railroad Commission, which we've talked about a little bit and touched on, is kind of absurd. Based on what the Railroad Commission does and doesn't do, if elected, what are the actions that you could take to make sure that Texas can transition to like cleaner energy, that we hold these oil and gas companies accountable, and that we take care of our population and our environment for years to come?
Yeah, and I do want to stress that part of the reason I wanted to run for this is because I have 35 years of experience that tells me just how complex all of those things you talked about are, right? We have a lot of interests to balance. We need for the oil companies to step up and eliminate some of their worst practices. And at the same time, we need to make sure that the jobs don't go away. And we also need to make sure that the all the infrastructure, like the wells and the pipelines, if suddenly we no longer had oil companies, who's going to tend to those things? Because they will leak, they will erode, they will corrode, and we will have an environmental remediation problem, the likes of which we have never seen. So there's a lot of balancing of interests to do. And that's, the answer to your question is a complex one, because what we need is the Railroad Commission to actually get in there and do the job that Texans elect them, the commissioners, to do, which is balance all of these issues, take a hard look at all of the science, the environmental practices, how we need to transition in various places, and as we can, from oil and gas extraction to cleaner, greener energy. Even the oil companies know that we've probably seen peak oil and that we need to transition to cleaner, greener energy. And some of them have already been investing in those portfolios. So it's a complex issue. It's a complex business, but we need to guide ourselves with the goalposts of exactly what you've been asking about and what we're all talking about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about your campaign again, and you have been running. Progress Texas has endorsed you. You're on the ballot in both July for the primary runoff and November. So I assume you've been hard at work. But how has your campaign transformed, and how can voters get connected with you and your work?
All right. So the number one thing I'm going to ask anybody who's watching this to do, and it's not going to cost you more than the Post-it. Take a Post-it and a pen and write hashtag Chrysta for Texas on it. And it's spelled, you can see it on the screen there, CHRYSTA for Texas, all spelled out. If you will put that on a Post-it and stick it on the side of your computer, and every day when you go online, go in and repost and retweet and share and ask everybody else to share. That is a huge communications tool. And obviously, as a candidate, the number one challenge we have is getting the word out about who I am, what I'm running for, and why it is so important to every Texan that we get this right, this election cycle. So that's the number one thing that I would say we could do. Then I just wanted to tell you about how we're engaged in, the new technology of Zoom, which I think is awesome. We're trying to roll out a plan where we are literally going to do a Chrysta town hall on oil and the economy all around the state. And we're going to try to do it, focusing on different areas of the state for the next 10 weeks, leading up to the primary runoff. And because I think everybody, no matter where you are in the state, you're going to have a slightly different perspective about what this whole job means to you. In Houston, where we've got the big headquarters, different issue than if you're out in and among the wells and the flares. And if you're in the Big Bend area and all of the water is being taken from the aquifer and used for fracking, and you don't have it for your ranching, that's a different issue than if you're in the hill country and you're worried about that pipeline. So I'm really excited to take this around the state and talk to people about the issues that impact them.
That's wonderful. And I'm so excited that you're kind of like dividing up the state as well, because you're right. I mean, folks have different concerns. If they're in your talks with voters from across the state, what do you think is the one thing that populates up that everyone asks about?
I think that almost everybody asks, what's the Railroad Commission do and why should I care? That's probably the number one thing. But of course, when I'm talking to Democrats, we do have this environmental mindset. And so most people want to know, what are we going to do about the environment? And what are we going to do about climate change? And do I believe in climate change? And do I believe in the environment? And the answer is yes. I believe that climate change is real and that it's impacted by oil and gas extraction. And the oil companies believe that too, by the way. They have finally come out, although it took them until December of last year, to officially recognize that they are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and that they need to do something about it. And they're doing it by re-injecting, they have a plan to try to re-inject carbon into the formations that they're producing. There's that question. And then I think one of the great ways we can talk about the Railroad Commission race, and I encourage you to do this with anybody, whether they're on the right or the left. Most Texans, 80%, according to the Texas Tribune, believe in environment issues, okay? So they believe that the EPA needs to exist. They believe in clean air, clean water, don't mess with Texas, And those are the talking points that we should use about why the Railroad Commission is so important. So those things are things you could share too.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Kind of trying to wrap us up, and I invite folks, if you have questions, please drop them in the comments about the Railroad Commission or about Chrysta. What is something that you're looking forward to right now, like post-COVID, I guess?
Post-COVID, I'm looking forward to drinking a margarita on a patio again. Not my patio. I'm looking forward to maybe, taking a trip to the Big Bend area where my husband and I like to go and see the park, or maybe going to Padre and, hanging out on the beach for a bit. I do miss traveling. I miss seeing everybody here that I would normally be seeing in person. It's great to interact with people. I really do enjoy that part of campaigning a lot. And so I'm missing that aspect as well.
Wonderful. Well, you're on the ballot in July. How can folks, right now, Progress Texas is advocating for vote by mail right now, and we're kind of seeing that play out.
Right.
But as we move towards the runoff, what are your sights set on? I assume you're looking towards the runoff and November as well.
Oh, definitely. We are planning. So I'll give you one little background. I like to do athletic pursuits of various types, and I actually have a black belt in Taekwondo. And one of the things I started doing it because my son, who was 7 at the time, wanted to do Taekwondo, and I'm, as his mom, I'm sitting there going, okay, this is an hour. What can I be doing with the hour? So I joined the class and I ended up getting a black belt. But one of the things in Taekwondo that they teach you to do is to punch through the target. And so my goal here is to set my sights far beyond July 14th, the runoff, to November, to when I actually take office. And that's where my mindset is right now, is in trying to figure out what am I going to be doing then. But I need all of y'all's help, not only to post it, but if you can, please go to ChrystaForTexas.com, check out my website, click through to Act Blue and donate anything you can. It is enormously expensive to run across the state. And so please help me out if you are capable of doing so. We are closing in on $100,000 raised on the cycle. And I'm super excited about that. I will be the first Railroad Commission candidate in decades from the Democrat side, at least, to clear that kind of a hurdle. And I would love to have your support. And for those of you who have already donated, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Chrysta. Do you have any final words that you want to leave us with about the Railroad Commission, about yourself?
I want to thank everybody who's watching this. It's enormously humbling to have people who are so interested in Texas and in good representation, that they would take time out of their day to pay attention to something that very few people know about, but that's so ultimately important. Your time and attention really does matter to all of us, because it's your time and attention that helps us make a better Texas. So thank you.
Thank you, Chrysta. And I think that's what we're all aiming for with your race. Chrysta Castañeda is here with us at Progress Texas. Progress Texas has endorsed Chrysta for the July runoff, and we're looking forward to seeing you turn Texas blue at near the top of this ticket up in July and November.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chrysta. Thanks everyone for joining.
Bye-bye, everybody. See you in July.